Hello and welcome to yet another edition of your weekly international current affairs program, Globe Watch from the Cameroon Radio Television with me, Charles Bune, from the official residence of the South African Diplomatic Mission in Yaoundé, Cameroon. 31 years ago, democracy came in South Africa at the tail of the end of the brutal apartheid system which existed plus a century, at least for those who matter South African history. The apartheid regime was one of the most brutal, which dispersed people across the country and across the continent. Many ways were used to combat the apartheid system in South Africa, and one of the ways was literary publication to raise awareness globally of what was happening in the country. One of the victims of the apartheid system in South Africa is my guest today, who has a barrage of publications which reflect the South Africa of yesterday, today, and possibly tomorrow. Today he serves as the High Commissioner of South Africa to Cameroon with a number of publications like The Lost Language of the Soul, Nelson Mandela et Mandla Langa, Être libre n'est pas seulement se débarrasser des chaînes, The Texture of Shadows, and of course, The Lost Colors of the Chameleon. How do we understand this for a better comprehension of South Africa? Mandla Langa, thank you very much indeed for being my guest.
Thank you very much for being the person that's talking about, or that's helping me to talk about what's going on in the creative world regarding South Africa.
Absolutely. Well, you are known in Cameroon as the South African High Commissioner and to the diplomatic community. But apart from that, before being a diplomat, you were equally a journalist. You were at one moment in prison to combat the apartheid regime in South Africa. And above all, you are an author. And in a moment, we'll be talking about your books. First, why did you decide to write?
I think I must have been about 19 years old when I became aware of the fact that there were so many things in my country that needed reflection, that needed reporting. And I knew that there were some people that I admired, whose books I was reading, who were doing a sterling job in reporting about their own countries. For instance, in Kenya, I was reading Jomo Kenyatta's memoir, Facing Mount Kenya, and in other countries there was a lot of activity. And that gave me an impetus.
I'm talking about Kenya. Did you ever read the publications of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ngugi wa Miru?
Ngugi has been my absolute inspiration, okay. And I was lucky to have met him a number of times, okay. Yes, yeah. And Ngugi wa Miru also, I met him in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
Coming back to South Africa, it was a country that was so full of possibilities, of potential, but at the same time, as you have said in your introduction, it was a country that was undergoing the scourge of apartheid. And so we had to make our little contribution as writers to try and reflect the pain and also the triumph of the human spirit when it came to people that were struggling, not passively, but struggling actively to dismantle the apartheid
regime in South Africa. Now let's talk about one of your publications, The Lost Language of the Soul, roughly 12,000 words in 34 chapters, containing 393 pages. Here with me, what is the key message you want to send across this novel?
This novel is very important to me. It's one of the books that has existed in my head for over 20 years. And it speaks about the connectivity of Africa at the end of the day, the fact that our liberation as South Africa was also irreversibly intertwined with the anguish and with the aspirations of the African continent. It's a story of a young boy, 14 years old, who is a Zambian who gets to be detached from his family in Lusaka and travels with a group of ANC guerrillas across the borders all the way deep into South Africa looking for his mother. In essence, it's a story of what it is. It's a quest novel. We are looking for something and we are finding it sometimes not in our own countries, but in other countries on the African continent.
Well, let's just read a portion of the prologue of the publication, The Lost Language of the Soul. This is what you say just at the prologue. At the exact moment of his death in the dream, Joseph wakes up and walks around the bar room of Aunt Susie Juma's tavern in a state of stunned relief. He's been having these dreams of late, which leave him mouth dry, even as he washes, dresses, and jumps the Primus stove to boil 2 eggs in a pot. He has to keep sleeping himself to be reassured that he is still alive. You have a sense of a grim humor. Why that choice of literary device?
Well, one of the most important thing about a tragic situation, in South Africa we've got this expression that even in tragedy, even in death, people have to find a possibility of humor. For instance, in our country, whenever there's a funeral, the wake before the funeral is usually one of the most interesting times because people tell stories. And so rather than being mournful, I try to devise or find a tone that will be, on the one hand, reflecting on what's going on, but at the same time, not burdening the reader with grim or with grimness or with, a somber unhappiness.
Okay. Let me just go to chapter 21 of the book again. You say somewhere, she tells Sis Violet, who's introduced herself to Bautumelo Mokwanya, to call her Maleseko mother. She wishes her 18-month-old daughter hadn't died 4 months ago because Leseko just took at him, pretending that butter wouldn't meet his mouth. He's a real handful, and now it's double trouble with her nephew, Pelefo. I just wonder what was the context of the time you were writing this book in the South African community.
When this book, the milieu, the time, and the place that is covered by this book is, of course, as I've said, a number of continents, a number of countries on the African continent, because you traverse, you move from Zambia all the way to Botswana, from Botswana into South Africa. But this is happening around the 1980s, which was one of the most violent, one of the bloodiest periods in the history of South Africa. When
on the heels of the Soweto massacre in 1976 and all of the African church today.
10 years, 15 years, 10 years after, let's say, Soweto, when the country was undergoing a number of states of emergency. And there was not only the violence inside South Africa, but there was also the cross-border violence by the regime crossing over into neighboring states and killing people. I've lost a number of my friends, in Botswana, in Lesotho, and so on and so forth. So it was at a period when there was a lot of bloodletting, but at the same time, it's a very essential period because it's the time of the highest form of resistance on the side of our people. Here, the section you've just read details something which I think is very important, and that is the involvement of women, especially those women we might just disparage as people from the villages, but women nevertheless who bore the brunt of the struggle.
Why will you decide on the title, The Lost Language of the Soul?
For me, the title, I can never write without having a title.
Sure.
And for me, the title describes a very, very essential thing in among people, and that is the power of communication. And what we communicate the depth of how we feel, the depth of our soul. So once that language gets lost, it means then that the people are plunged into confusion. And it is when they reclaim that language, when that lost language of the soul is reclaimed, then that's when people can say, we are healing, we are triumphing over adversity.
The next publication I would like us to talk is The Lost Colors of the Chameleon, written in 7 parts containing 326 pages. Why do you have an obsession for the word lost?
Because I think it's an obsession with having to find something. My books are usually a quest, are usually people moving from point A to point Z.
What was missing that you kept on searching, the lost of this? And who is the chameleon here?
In this book, which is an allegory of what was going on in some of the African jurisdictions where you had dictatorships. And this is a book about people finding a possibility to dislodge the dictatorship. And so the chameleon is one of the main actors who came from the trade union movement and rose up until he himself becomes a leader. The issue I'm trying to illustrate is that sometimes a person comes and has got all the best intentions, and then somewhere along the line, power comes into play, and that power corrupts him or her.
Absolute power corrupts,
absolutely. And then that person starts to become exactly like that type of thing which he was trying to struggle against.
Let me just read part 5 of what you describe yourself as an allegory. And chapter 3 of part 5, it says just at the beginning, in the 10 days before the raid on Mariposa, Hero had been having a series of nightmares. In the dream, he was always driving in his car and it was late at night. Somewhere he knew that he was going to lose the car. He didn't know how he knew this, but he was never surprised to find himself walking along a narrow, tree-lined street whose ominous gloom was simultaneously livened and heightened by an irregular sheen from an earlier drizzle of the tarmac. Here again, you mix sweet and bitter memories. This portion, what are you actually referring to? The early days of a good dictatorship which becomes chaotic towards the end?
Well, this is, at this stage, we are heading towards the most advanced stage of the dictatorship. And it's also the stage when the dictatorship starts to lose its grip. And Hero is a reflection of exactly the type of person that gets to be corrupted by power, because he was a security, how do you say, securocrat. He was the one in charge of the monarch's safety and the rest of it. Only he also had a lot of ambition to become a prince or to become someone in the monarch's, in the president's court.
How compelling are your publications?
Well, this book, The Lost Colors of the Chameleon, it won the Commonwealth Prize for the best novel in Africa in 2010, 2009, 2010.
When South Africa was about to host the World Cup.
The World Cup, yes. And we had to go to Auckland in New Zealand as part of the Commonwealth
Summit.
Yeah.
Okay. To collect your award.
The award, yes. And that's where, yeah, I met quite a number of other writers from various places. So it has had, you know, an impact. And this book and that one, The Texture of Shadows, are books that have really sold very well, and they've, you know, received a lot of acclaim in South Africa.
Roughly 12,000 words, 371 pages. The Texture of Shadows, again by Mandla Langa. What is the place of imagination as an author in your publications?
Imagination comes from experience, it comes from dreaming, it comes from observation, it comes from an ability, perhaps, and I don't know how best that ability is, but an ability to reimagine, to look at the world and try and reconfigure and see the extent to which that which is unresolved can be resolved. Imagination comes from watching people in action, because without being an observer, and this is where I think my training also as a journalist helps, in the sense that whenever I'm in a situation, I try to look at it and try and think how I can reflect on it, even when I'm no longer in that situation, whether it's a room or a meeting or any circumstance.
The Texture of Shadows in the World of an Imagination, chapter 1, this is what you write, titled Jungle. Back in the time that's lost in noise and silence, a group of 12 men crosses the border from Botswana into South Africa at the shallowest point of the Pitsan Molopo. I presume is a river.
It's a river, yes.
They march through the sleepy village named after the river at midnight on 17 December 1987. Willy-nilly, this should be the story of Mandla Langa, who escaped from South Africa at a very tender age, roughly 14 or 15 years, if I'm not wrong, went to Botswana, went to Angola, went to Zambia, Zimbabwe, traveled to the United Kingdom in search of liberty, possibly a land of freedom which you had lost in your country, if you like, identity. This should be you, right?
I think every writing there is an element of autobiography, and I have taken various snippets, various chunks of my own life and fictionalized it and used it as a substrate, as an inspiration for the characters, not only the main characters, but even for secondary characters.
Tell me, how much of you is in these literary publications, in your life of moving from one place to another? at the time when your country was under one of the most brutal regimes in the world?
Well, I grew up in a township called Kwamashu in Durban, and it was, we had been moved as part of the Group Areas Act from a cosmopolitan place called Mayville in Durban to this Kwamashu township, which
the Group
was
Area Act, one of the legislations in South Africa during the apartheid regime, which separated people, especially whites from blacks.
Blacks, yes, and it was one of the most brutal acts. And I remember that when we moved from Mayville to this wasteland, there was nothing where we moved to. And I was still very young, and it was very terrifying to see my father trying to make sure that we were not too scared about finding ourselves in this place, which is, there was no electricity, there was no light, just darkness. And a lot of families went through that.
And that is why there is a lot of element of grim in your publications, right?
Well, the grimness, yes, as I've said, I try to live in it with humor, because if you allow the grimness to overcome you, then you are headed for the madhouse.
Of course, you said that there is always a glimmer of hope in all your publications, and that is why you mix melancholy and happiness.
Absolutely.
One of the most outstanding publications of yours is, of course, the memoir of President Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela et Mandla Langa. Être libre n'est pas seulement se débarrasser des chaînes. You are one of the autobiographers of President Nelson Mandela. Tell me, first of all, your encounters with him.
During the preparation for a huge festival in Wembley in 1990.
The famous stadium in London.
Yes, in London, which was to celebrate his return.
Liberation after 1991.
After 1990, after he had been
11
released.
February.
In 11 February, yeah. And well, like everyone, I was overawed by this titan, this great man. And but he was very, very convivial, very open, and also full of humor. And but much more importantly, he made me want to do this book, because I felt that someone who comes out of prison, who had been incarcerated for 27 years, and still has got this life, this liveliness, that someone, and also full of forgiveness, full of grace, full of acceptance of his condition, was a phenomenon that we had never come across. And that's how it struck me.
Okay.
You know.
Of your so many publications I have read, this is the most voluminous, roughly 14,000 words. Nelson Mandela and Mandla Langa in 457 pages. I hope I get it correctly. What is the central message you are sending across this book, which is in 13 chapters?
Nelson Mandela was one of the few people who to understand the exigencies of power, to understand that power is much more usable when you relinquish it than when you grab it. When, for instance, in 1997, when he gave up being the president of the African National Congress and handed over also and had just one term of office as president in South Africa.
1999.
He became a lot more powerful than if he had, how to say this, hogged that seat and said that he's not going to give up to any.
In this publication, you raise so many issues. You talk about the structural transformation of South Africa under President Nelson Mandela. You talk about media, democracy, political transformation, economic transformation. What is in this book, Nelson Mandela and Mandla Langa, about Mandela's life and governance that is not found in any other book like The Long Walk to Freedom by himself?
I think a number of things. For instance, in The Long Walk to Freedom, it's, the earlier years. But these are the 5 years when Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa. It speaks about some of the areas which have never been made public. For instance, if you look at the book, there's a lot of handwritten notes.
No, sure.
And in a sense, it became an archivist's dream, really, because there was notations on the margins which had not been made public. The way Mandela was conscious about the fact that no African, if there's no liberation in other parts of Africa, there's no liberation in the whole of Africa. And the need to resolve the problems of some of the other countries. For instance, if you look at how he tried assiduously to resolve the issue that was happening in the DRC, in Zaire then, Mobutu and also the first Kabila. He tried very hard to make sure that there was that resolve. That was one. But secondly, the one thing that you'll never find in other publications is how Mandela was preoccupied with making sure that no African leader was humiliated by, let's say, Western powers. If you look at the way he dealt with the debacle that faced Muammar Gaddafi, when there was that bombing of a plane in Lockerbie, and the two Libyans.
And all the story related Ali Mohammed al-Migrahi.
The two Libyans, yes, who were accused of having fomented this. And there was an attempt by the US
the Panam plane,
and also the UK for these people to be tried in the United Kingdom or in the United States, which would have been a great humiliation for Muammar Gaddafi. And he traveled. At the time there was a blockade, there was a no-fly zone. And he traveled from Tunis, drove all the way to Benghazi to speak to Gaddafi, to accept the fact that the United Nations was going to then take over the execution or the prosecution of this case, and not the Scottish and
December 30, 1996. Meeting with officers of the SAPO, a report released by the National Information Management Center of SAPOs showed that the 1996 saw a reduction in levels of summons, crimes, and whatsoever, blah, 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 you can go on. South Africa is known the world over as one of the most violent communities. How did the president, in particular, handle the crime situation in South Africa?
Well, he was very much aware of the issue of crime in South Africa. But much more importantly, he was also as aware of the causes of crime. the socio-economic situation, the underpinnings of crime.
Best expressed by the Inkatha uprisings in 1994 with Walter Sisulu and others.
Absolutely, the history of the country. I think a country that was born out of a very, very, very violent circumstance inevitably gave birth to a very, very violent fruit. And the oppression itself had given rise to a certain pathology that had to be curbed.
Which is that pathology? Which is that disease?
The disease of people feeling that if I can't get this, I'm going to get it.
To use crime as the best way to get what they had lost over the years.
They had lost throughout the years.
I would like us to conclude the interview by your personal connection and what possibly President Mandela told you, because you wrote his memoir with his authorization. Something that he told you that he never did to another person. I know that in this book, possibly at the end, you find Gracia Marcel, the president's last wife, and how he transitioned to a new marital family. What did Mandela tell you about power and life that he didn't tell any other person?
Mandela was very suspicious of power because he had seen it from the time when he was a young man growing up in the Tembu royal household. And he was aware and felt that power is ephemeral, and the only way power can be used is for the good of the people. And I was with my brother, who was the Chief Justice in South Africa, and they were talking about the fact that there was something that was most likely going to happen, which was going to really disrupt the South African judicial circumstance. And Mandela's view of this was that whatever happens, my brother Pius must stick to his guns, must make sure that he does not allow any interference coming in from anywhere to take him from the route that he was taking.
Even if it had to come from Mandela?
Even if it had to come from Mandela. That is the essence and the power ultimately of what makes our judiciary. We might have a lot of problems, but one thing that everybody admits is that our judiciary is still very strong. Our constitution, on which everything hangs, is still admired the world over as being one of the best constitutions, in the sense that its Bill of Rights really, really puts people at the center. And so these were some of the lessons.
And with that, we conclude the interview. South African author and diplomat Mandla Langa, thank you very much indeed for being my guest.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thanks for your very in-depth understanding of our situation, and also thanks to the people of Cameroon and to the listeners and audiences.